The digital transition. The Digital Transition, a podcast series created to assist those tasked with implementing digital strategies, where we will share our knowledge and experiences to support you in your transition. Welcome to The Digital Transition. I'm your host, Nathan Hildebrandt, and today I'm talking with Kate Williams from FrontierSI about digital twins and some of the exciting projects that she's been involved in and the benefits that these digital twins are providing. But before I talk to Kate, I need to talk to you about our exclusive podcast sponsor, NBS. So NBS Chorus allows you to specify your project in Uniclass 2015, which is recommended by the Queensland Government BIM Data and Information Guidelines, as well as the Victorian Digital Asset Strategy Guidelines, and mandated by Transport for New South Wales. So to learn more about NBS, head to their website, www.nbs.com.au. So, Kate, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Kate, some people in Melbourne would be aware of your work if they'd attended a Melbourne event, but for the listeners that are across the globe, that wouldn't be aware of, I guess, your role and what you've done in your career, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm one of those really lucky people that chanced upon a university degree. I didn't know anything about it, but I've had a 20-year career that I've really loved, all working in the same area in spatial science. So I went straight from my degree in geomatic engineering to a job as a spatial analyst at an engineering consulting company, doing a lot of work in creation of data, so roads data sets, all of the types of things that you see on a map, and then moved on to, creating analysis for decision making and a lot of work in the infrastructure sector, particularly helping on the environmental approval process, but also using satellite data to create new information about the world to help people understand environmental impacts and other things like that. So I moved on from 19 years in engineering consulting to a job in the Victorian government. I worked on one of their biggest digitisation projects of the cadastre, which is the property boundaries. So that's to create a more accurate data set that's easier to maintain and easier to improve the positional accuracy over time. So as part of that project, I worked on a demonstrator project, the Victorian Government's first digital twin project down at Fisherman's Bend. It's obviously a great use case for digital data sets and accurate digital data sets. And that was a great experience and my first real branded digital twin project. Since then, I've moved on to a not-for-profit, FrontierSI, as the Chief Business Officer. So involved in developing the business, finding new opportunities for us, but also still heavily involved in digital twin projects and initiatives.
It's just a small CV. And that's the thing that I really love about the guests that like yourself, taking your time and bringing your, 2 decades of experience to the listener base that we have. We'll talk about some of the projects that you've covered later on in our discussion, but can you explain to the listeners the services that FrontierSI provide so that, if they want to reach out to you, what are the things, how could you help them?
Yeah, FrontierSI, it's a pretty unique business. It was born out of a CRC. So one of the CRCs has actually turned into a viable ongoing business. We were the CRC for spatial information, hence the SI. We're a not-for-profit now. We're still a partnership organisation, so we're working with government, university and the private sector. We're purpose-driven, so we're here to make sure that Australia and New Zealand get the best social, economic and environmental outcomes from the use of spatial information. So Earth observation data, positioning, your GPS and other analytics that creates new data and new insights. So what do? We help people across a range of different sectors make use of that technology. It could be agriculture. We've been working with people in finance and insurance, in the banks as well, looking at how that spatial information can create new insights so you can make better decisions.
Wow. The technical partner, I'd call you.
Yeah, look, sometimes, and I think we'll find it in lots of industries, there's a lot of really amazing work that goes on at the government sector, but also in universities. But it's not often translated into operation, and people don't always see it get through to, driving the real benefits that it can. So we're really there to help broker those multi-party agreements that bring the best from the university and the private sector to solve government problems or industry problems. So we think of ourselves as brokers, but also the people that help translate all that good work. Just as an example, one of the programs we've done a lot of work on is Digital Earth Australia, which is an amazing Australia-wide project creating a data cube of Landsat, so satellite information, plus all the tools to create new insights from that. So we've been working with the Geoscience Australia team on DEA to understand how different industries can use that data, how they can tailor products and services so that it's easy for industries to consume.
I love the big words that you use. There's so much going on. It's like I'm trying to think how I could depackage this. But in essence, big data and being able to and you call yourself a broker, but I kind of look at it as maybe possibly being the bridge. You're the bridge and assisting people gaining insights and knowledge that university has created and all this technology, and then being able to bring it to market essentially, because that's where I guess universities struggle in most times. It's very good research, but commercializing it.
Yeah, and it's a difficult thing to do. And look, Nathan, I've only been at FrontierSI for a year. I've watched on kind of in awe for a couple of years, and now I get a chance to get involved. It's not easy, but it's really important. There's a lot of, as you say, I might use a lot of jargon and big words. I apologize. I try not to, so I really apologize if I have. But we want to see people getting value from this. And I think, in the theme of your podcast, Digital Transition, this is really what it's about. It's making sure that people can keep up with and make use of technology, so we don't have this kind of two-speed world where some people, they can really get the value from it and then other people can't. And I think in Australia, there's some great examples. We've got some states that have got heaps of money and are investing heavily in digital, and there are others that aren't. So Australia-wide initiatives that allow us all to get on board and all use the power of digital is really important to me.
No. Now, the primary reason, I guess, for bringing you on to the podcast today was to talk to you about digital twins. Now, the reason for having a third podcast specifically about digital twins is because my frustrations in industry today. It's surrounded by miscommunication by people that are trying to use the digital twin branding or naming as marketing jargon to make them sound like they're doing more than what they really are. And I have arguments and fights with lots of people about this, but as someone that has been involved in industry, delivering digital twin projects, what is a digital twin in your opinion?
So great question, Nathan. And I will start by saying I think the concept is still sorting itself out, and looking over the fence at BIM, how many years later we're still having that same conversation about what's BIM. So firstly, I am not going to give you a definitive answer because it will change over time, but I'll give you what I think today. How about that as a bit of a caveat?
We'll look back in a decade's time.
Yeah. So for me, a digital twin is a digital representation of something that exists in the real world or has existed in the past or might exist in the future. But not only is it that digital representation, it actually allows you to simulate the way that piece of infrastructure or that system operates in the real world. So having a 3D model of something, it's not a digital twin. It's an important part of a digital twin, but you need to be able to ask it a question. So what? What if I, put a roadblock here? What happens to traffic? Or what if I take down this wall? What happens to the structure? So you have to be able to scenario build and ask what if. And for me in Spatial, one of the things that digital twins must have is they must exist in real world coordinates so that they can be integrated with other digital twins. So a model of a building, it might be amazingly detailed. You might be able to do a range of things. What if I shut this door? What can I do with the HVAC system? But if it's sitting at 0, 0, it doesn't have, for me, one of the fundamental elements of a twin, which is it can't be put in context. It can't relate to other things around it. And it can't really sit within the real world. What about temperature outside, angles of the sun? If you plant a tree, if your neighbour builds a building, if it doesn't have a coordinate, you can't put it into a street or a precinct or a city or a state, you've missed a really vital element.
I like the majority of your comment or your statement.
Which bit do you disagree with?
Well, the thing I struggle with is the concept, and this is probably going to digress and take us on a whole different journey. But and the thing is, I think there's good value in debate in this podcast as well, because it then kind of gives a couple of different perspectives. But the one thing I struggle with is the one that isn't built, because that, from my perspective, that's still just the world of building information modeling. And the way I see a digital twin from my view and from the kind of Gemini principles that it was all founded upon was about the real life connecting to a digital. And when it's not built yet, there's no physical connection to it. So that's okay. We're all entitled to it, and you're in that world. So the listeners can believe you and just ignore me because you're the expert.
Look, I think it's a great point, and that ability for connection between the real world and the digital is an important factor. However, we kind of, in the city scale, the most important questions are the what if questions. And I think being able to go forward in time, having multiple scenarios about the future is really important. One of the data sets that we have been working on in the past, and we're seeing lots of different initiatives at the moment, is sea level rise as an example. Having sea level rise, being able to envision it in a city in 3D, in a digital twin, is actually a really powerful thing. It enables people to make different decisions, and hopefully those decisions might be about the way we design a city, as well as the things we do to limit climate change. So I really strongly advocate for future, and it could be multiple futures. We don't actually have to know about the future, but we have to be able to plan for it.
All right. I'll still sit on the fence on that one, though. I still think it's. I wouldn't call it a digital twin. I'd more call it analysis, BIM analysis in terms of environmental and stuff. But that's all good. We won't stick on that and keep going round and round in circles, because it'll be a circular debate. But trying to tie this back to things that people can relate to, and because it's very hard for most asset owners that may be listening to kind of go, well, what's this all mean for me in my world, and how does this make sense? And one of the things I want to relate it back to is a question that was put forward on another social kind of platform called Clubhouse, and it was a discussion about digital twins. Now, I just want to ask you, people interact with Google Maps on a day-to-day basis, and the question was, is Google Maps a form of a digital twin? And what's your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I'll start with a little anecdote. So when I first started my career in GIS, people would say, "What's that?" I would explain it. I'm in Melbourne, and they'd say, like the Melways, which is like the Sydney UBD or something. And I'd say, "Oh, kind of like the Melways, but it's inside of your computer." And then along came Google Maps. And people started saying, like Google Maps. And that was a great moment for my industry because, yes, what we do is more like Google Maps than a piece of paper. So good. But is Google Maps a digital twin? As I said before, I don't like to get too hung up on definitions because they will change. But for me, Google Maps is not quite a digital twin. I think it could be an important ingredient for a digital twin. It's got amazing data. It's definitely got a temporal element. And maybe, Nathan, it does change a little bit as the world changes. You've got traffic, amazing traffic and routing in there. So it does help you make decisions. But for me, the thing about Google Maps that I find doesn't really go with what I think of as a digital twin is the ecosystem around it. I think of digital twins as being a very collaborative, multidisciplinary, engaging platform and program. For me, Google Maps is very specific. It's very kind of it allows you to do one thing maybe, or, find an address and find a route to that address and maybe options and traffic. But it's not a particularly collaborative environment. It doesn't allow lots of different people to bring data and share it and aggregate it and I think that's part of an essential piece of a digital twin. And maybe where we're seeing, that BIM to digital twin handover.
Ooh, I like that one, but I still disagree. It's funny how I go one way with the other, but Google Maps saved me the other day. I had to drive back from the Sunshine Coast and, an accident on the Bruce Highway. There's no joke there. That always seems to be the case. But,
yeah.
It told me a new route. It said, you want to go a different way. So for me, it was real time telling me what to do. Yes, it has a sole purpose, but when it comes to digital twins, an asset owner may have a digital twin for a single purpose as well. So that's kind of where I kind of get at it.
Yeah.
But, it's good to have debate and arguments. So
yeah, well,
we're going to add to the confusion.
Nathan.
We're going to add to the confusion.
No, I said maybe. And look, just on Google products, Google Earth Engine, I'd say absolutely is a digital twin. So Google's definitely in the business of digital twins.
Well, they're in the business of data mining and knowing everything we do to determine what's the best advertising to put in front of us. So that's analytics going in the background to put things in front of us that might want us to buy things, which is scary. And it's only going to get worse, Fifth Element style. Now, we have the understanding, most people understand the concept now of buildings and infrastructure and seeing all of these visualizations with models. That looks all good. They can go, okay, I can understand how a digital twin may work with that concept. How does the spatial industry contribute to digital twins? Now, you did touch on it briefly in your introduction regarding, sea levels and talking about plantings and that, but how does the spatial industry actually directly contribute to digital twins?
Yeah, look, I think I said the word context and doing a bit of homework for this podcast, Nathan. I did listen to your digital twin discussion with Anna Murray and she definitely highlighted that context element of digital twin. I think the spatial industry sees it a little more richly than context. So absolutely we allow the infrastructure to be put into the landscape and to make better decisions about its how that landscape can impact upon it. And I've mentioned shading as an example or traffic, but I think also will help understand how the piece of infrastructure can impact on that wider landscape. So whether that's the impact on people or the impact on environment. Spatial is really about that bigger picture, that systems-wide picture, and the ability to aggregate up And I think that's a really important role that we play. Spatial has always been in the business of big things, statewide maps, national maps. What we're able to do is to take the very high resolution information that you might have about a particular building. We're then able to take the key pieces of information that would be useful to be aggregated up for that precinct scale, city scale. The other key thing is the concept of being able to find and access data. I think that's where Spatial has a really important role to play. We all have that kind of mental picture of, 1,000 files sitting in someone's server. But how do you find the one that you want? Address is good, but being able to draw a box over an area and say, what have we got here? That way of finding data, Spatial is really an amazing way to collect and curate data for really easy access. And lots of the big CAD software vendors are enabling you to do that kind of clip and search, rather than going through convoluted file structures. Let's pan to the area that we want. Let's see what the information that we have about a particular area.
The biggest problem actually is with most software and the challenges I think that most people in industry are essentially flat earthers. And it's a conversation I've had with numerous people on the podcast, even Greta from BAC last week, because she comes from a GIS background as well. There's no software out there that can actually cope with real world coordinates so well in the flat world. And, we won't even touch on the fact that that Australia actually moves on its tectonic plate, and how's a digital twin going to essentially, with the digital twins, or is there software around that understands the movement of the tectonic plate and then moves the digital twin with it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Nathan, and it is an important one here in Australia, and particularly for our cousins over in New Zealand. It's an even more important question. It's kind of a long and boring answer, but absolutely. And Australia and New Zealand and other countries, of course, are working on making sure that we have dynamic datums or an actual understanding of position and time, not pretending that position is static. And look, the Digital Cadastre Modernisation Project that I was speaking about really is the type of new data set that will include time, that will help move the position of features over time.
That's probably a little bit too technical for most of our listeners, but it's just something that, people don't realise that we're moving constantly.
And actually not by a small amount. And it's worth kind of keeping in mind that time is always something that you should keep in your data sets.
Well, that's a big important thing to note, that because I think I saw a post on LinkedIn the other day from a surveyor, and they were talking about it was from TMR, and they were talking about the position of a intersection, and I think over 5 years or something, it had moved a meter in
Wow.
space and time.
Yeah, that's a lot. And look, I think it's important to think about, I have heard on a couple of your podcasts as well, that autonomous future we have with driverless vehicles, really important that those systems understand that movement as well.
Well, that's where you guys are going to solve the problem for us, aren't you? in the spatial industry.
Personally. My colleagues.
But you're going to form the bridge between the experts and industry. That's what your role will be.
Yeah, and to make it simple, actually, because your software and your measurement devices should help you do that. It shouldn't be so hard in the future.
Now, one of the things that we talked about when we caught up to talk about what we would cover off on in this conversation, and I think you started talking about the importance of data and data management and being able to find it, through, being able to get to it in its real life. And one of the interesting acronyms, and I try to remove acronyms from life because they frustrate me, but you talked about FAIR. there's nothing that's fair in life. We all know that. But you want to talk about something that's fair in relation to data principles. Now, obviously there's data principles, but how is that actually really important for digital twins? Now, taking that step back, you talked about, everyone contributing to a digital twin. So what's fair?
So the FAIR principles came out a few years ago now. Maybe 2016 was an update and when I first heard about them. And I mentioned before that the spatial industry and spatial science and technology can really help people find data in a really natural way. Zooming to a map, drawing a box or putting an address is a great way to find the information that you're looking for. So when FAIR came to my attention, I really thought it was a useful way to think about the way that we manage data and the way that we prepare data for others to use it as well. So the F is for fair, findable, as I said. The A is for accessible. So having data that is locked up in your desk drawer on a CD is not accessible. So creating the systems and tools that allow other people to use that data is a really important part of the data management role. The next is interoperable. So using open standards or standards that other people understand that can go from system to system. And I think you can see how important that is for digital twins. Having data that's locked up tight and can't be used or aggregated or examined with other information isn't going to help us drive the digital twins that we want for the future. And the last one's reusable. So making sure that the information has metadata so that you know what you can and can't do with it or how the information was made or designed, but also making it so that it's really clear what you've got and how. And I think, things like Uniclass and other standards for information that can help people understand what they're looking at. What does a blue line mean? There's somebody that's worked for a long time on the intersection between CAD and GIS, having everything on the same layer and just changing the colors or, it doesn't really help people reuse that data for other purposes. So I think FAIR is a really easy thing to remember. And it's got 4 really high-level concepts that if you think about those when you're creating or sharing data, we're going to be able to have, really rich digital twins into the future.
It's probably not just even relevant to digital twins, but in terms of creating information just for design and construction as well.
Absolutely. And look, we've heard on your podcast and in lots of places about how information is lost through the process or recreated. And I think if people were more aware of how what they're doing and the data that they're creating can support other activities down the chain and follow those FAIR principles, I think we would have a lot more efficient process.
Now, I want to move on to a case study. And case studies are always important because it's where lessons are learned, where knowledge can be shared about real life outcomes rather than talking about theory, which with a lot of the things that happen today, a lot of it is theory because not a lot of people have done a lot of the things that we're trying to, communicate and share. Now, there was a project that you worked on in New Zealand, and it was a vast project, and bringing the spatial industry's perspective to it. Most people at this point in time have a strong awareness of, or hopefully, or might have an awareness of digital twins when it kind of ties back to the building management systems or, in a building informing an asset owner that there's something wrong or the like. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about what you worked on this project in New Zealand, how it kind of has that digital twin, focus?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of years ago, FrontierSI put out a call for projects that we could co-fund in the digital twin space. We were looking for projects, Nathan, that really did have a bit of a point of difference from the projects that we saw councils and state governments funding, as well as infrastructure owners. And we got back an amazing suite of ideas. We co-funded 3 of them. And the one in New Zealand that you're referring to is called the Digital Twin for Flood Resilience. It's led by the University of Canterbury and LINZ, which is Land Information New Zealand, and also New Zealand's National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. So what that digital twin is trying to do, and it's underway at the moment, it's not complete yet, is looking at how you can use a digital twin to understand flood risk, understand opportunities to mitigate flood risk, and really do it at scale. So we all know that there's whole groups of people who are doing flood modelling and coming up with 1 in 100 year floods and maps and data sets and informing the planning cycle with that. It's a very established discipline, and they do fantastic work using really specialised software tools. What we're trying to do with the digital twin for flood resilience in New Zealand is to facilitate that type of work in a digital twin environment that allows you to do things rapidly. It allows you to test scenarios, but also that it allows you to do it at scale. So you see a lot of these flood models, they're very data hungry. They need to know the topography. They need to know where the buildings are, what's the floor level of the building, surface roughness, all of the types of things. They're hugely data hungry pieces of analysis. The University of Canterbury, LINZ, and the team there are looking to do that at scale using digital twin and bringing in that variety of data sets, but also publishing and sharing the data in digital twin so that people can really interact with that complexity of information. And that's something that the project is also looking at doing. You mentioned lessons learned. We have done a couple of roundtables with the 3 projects that we're co-funding. They've got very similar lessons, and the first one is still the effort that's required to bring together all of the rich data that you need to do this type of analysis. Data is still in silos. There's still a way to go in making data that's fair and making sure that all the data we have is accessible. But also there's a clear lack of standards. And just to use an example, it's really important to know where a building is, because a building, it stops water going straight. It channels water around it. But it's also important to know where the doors and the windows are. Because that impacts upon the risk. So what are the data sets that we have, and maybe that the BIM world has, and how do we make sure that we understand those key pieces of information so that we can transfer them between the systems? So we've learnt a lot, and we'll have some recommendations about standards and ontologies there. And we've also kind of really learned something we already knew, which is digital twins and the creation of digital twins is a multidisciplinary exercise. The value of a digital twin is in the domain that it's being used for. So you need to have the right people involved at the right time. And that's also at the governance level. So the steering committees on projects like that and on systems that will operate over time, they can't just have the technical people. They can't just be spatial scientists and digital engineers. They have to include the users and the people that are potentially going to benefit from the work that you're doing.
It's important, obviously, that you get the stakeholders in at the right time so that the technical people aren't just making assumptions about how a person may use that information. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah. I suppose it's more than treating the domain experts as a stakeholder. I think it's allowing them to have an insight into the governance of the project and the program, so that it's really going to add value and it's going to create the information in a way that they can consume it for their decision-making process.
A big issue facing the globe at the moment is climate change, and a substantial focus that's part of, the Institute of Architects here in Australia that I'm part of is about climate change and sustainability. And every time that point of discussion gets made about, well, as architects, we need to do better, and help inform the community about how we can be more sustainable. I say, well, there's a solution for that. There's solutions out there that technology can assist in that. Now, what are the specific use cases that, we talked about flooding, and right now, flooding is something that happens a lot more often because the storm activity seems to be more intense and less frequent than we get droughts and rain. But what other specific use cases can you suggest that digital twin can be used for either assessing environmental issues at a macro or a micro level, city level, suburb level, neighbouring level? What sort of things could people use it for?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that we've really put our mind to at FrontierSI, that kind of resilient communities and the way that digital tools can help with resilient decision making. So it's not just about being sustainable, it's about being able to adapt to the changes that we see coming and that unfortunately we can't now prevent. We are working on another digital twin project that looks at livability. I think livability really is related to this issue. So it's urban heat island effect. It's the issues of how people actually interact with the built form and how that might change under extreme weather, whether that's rainfall, flooding, or heat. And I think there's some great examples that look at that both at, in individual street level, and it might help councils with things like, simple things like planting trees or providing more water for those trees to grow and be healthier. Adaptation such as things like green walls and green roofs. Where should you do it? Where will you get most bang for your buck? But also at the broader scale. So we're going to see as well more intense bushfires, and the long-term effect of smoke on the community is quite a serious impact, and we see people having respiratory problems on days where there's burning off or bushfires. Digital twins can help both predict that, communicate that. I think that's really important. Communicate it in a way that people will understand, because you can see what we're talking about, but also will help understand the long-term impacts of that. So the third project that we're co-funding is looking at the impact of those environmental factors on the population and how they might change over time. I also mentioned earlier things like sea level rise, looking at mitigation or adaptation to those types of changes that we're seeing over the long term, I think is another really important case study.
Now, coming up in the next month, you're actually participating in it's a Smart Cities Digital Twin event where people could learn more about the work that you've been doing recently. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, we're going to be running an event at the Smart Cities Council's Digital Twin Week on the Tuesday. It's coming up in mid-October, where we'll have the researchers from each of the three projects we're co-funding talking a little bit more about their projects. And if you're listening to this podcast after October 2021, we'll put a link down the bottom so that you can replay that session. But we're going to go through those projects, and hopefully there'll be a good contrast or point of thought in a week that is going to have a lot of examples from the built form and from cities. We're hoping that our session will open people's mind up to the broader landscape digital twins that we want to see in the future.
We didn't even talk about smart cities at all. We haven't even covered off on that today, but is that the digital twin at the spatial level that you're talking about, Catherine? That's the size. That's kind of the beginnings of a smart city as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And look, I think what we're seeing, Victoria has got Digital Twin Victoria funded. They're really looking to drive a statewide digital twin. So it's a great thing for people to watch. What does that really mean? What's the type of information and the types of analyses that are going to be driven by a statewide digital twin? We're seeing the same thing coming out of New South Wales with their spatial digital twin. But interestingly, we're also seeing federal government signals that digital twins are interesting. The New Zealand government has just put out a draft infrastructure strategy, and it points to the need for, or the analysis of the need for, a digital twin for all of New Zealand. And we also see Infrastructure Australia's recent strategy pointing to these types of digital tools for decision-making nationwide. So it's a really interesting time to see how we might scale up our vision of digital twins. Maybe people are thinking about buildings or cities, how we might scale up that thinking to statewide or nationwide.
Yeah, and the Queensland government just released their draft infrastructure plan too. It does talk about digitisation, but it doesn't go into substantial detail at this stage as to what that will be, which is fair enough when it's a policy, and then we see responding documents to that afterwards. But you did touch on the work. Not originally. So before your current role, you were working for the Victorian government and the Fisherman Bend project. And you just explained that the Victorian government, through their policies, now are investigating a digital twin process. Now, it's kind of almost like a circle for you, because you said you were working on statewide, cadastral stuff for the government, and now they're starting to look at using digital twins for the process and assessing planning applications. Now, I know this isn't a project that you're specifically working on anymore because you've moved on and you're in a new role, but from the outside, how could a digital twin like this, in terms of the using it for the process of assisting in planning applications, how do you see that this could work, and how it could make the planning application process easier? Because really, at the end of the day, what governments are trying to do is to try and remove red tape, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think if you have a look at what they're doing in the Victorian government, they've got a pilot project called eComply, which is part of their digital twin initiative, and how you might use digital twin and digital tools to semi-automate that process of approval. I think that in Australia, we have quite an inefficient planning system. We've got very localized rules. It's hard to know if you're a national developer. You need people in each state to tell you what you can build and where, and it's quite a contestable process. I think digital will help with certainty on both sides. It will help the developer understand whether what they're suggesting is going to be approved. So, won't waste time in that back and forth. But it also helps the government, local government, for example, to be really clear about what you can and can't do, and help to signal to the market in a really easy way the types of development that are going to be acceptable. And the more you cut down the time it takes in the planning and approvals stage, the more you can get cracking on spending the money, driving the economy by building things. So it's a win-win, I think. And we've seen e-comply in Victoria, but we are seeing signals right across the country that this is a really great case study, because as first cab off the rank, it's actually really easy to quantify the dollar value of saving a day of time in that process. So it's a great case study because your big four can really quickly quantify that benefit.
Well, they can see because sometimes things are locked into planning applications for months and months on end, and if you can plug a model into a tool and it tells you that it's compliant on that site because all the parameters are locked in to say what's possible on that site, I can just imagine, even taking a step back from that and actually having, like a development checker before you even put an application forward. If I'm proposing to put this building on this site, what's wrong with it? Where do I comply? Where don't I comply? It'd simplify the town planning process of compliant development, wouldn't it?
Exactly, and that's what e-comply does. It when you see the demonstration, and if you have a chance to talk to Adam Molam or see some of the presentations he's been doing out of Victoria, it really clearly shows you, your setback. It's visualized as a purple surface and your building's in front of it. So it's really easy to adjust your design to see where it is and isn't complying. It's also worth mentioning that the planning industry is really well aware of the lack of digitisation in their process. Recently, the Planning Institute of Australia put out I think it's a document called Plan Tech, and it talks a bit about the fact that their industry needs to go on a digital transformation. So it's not just us in digital that's seeing the potential for planning. The industry itself has an appetite to change and an appetite to adopt digital processes.
It's a no-brainer, isn't it, in terms of a starting position, in terms of trying to leap forward at the front and cut a whole pile of time out, and ideally it'd hopefully make better quality submissions, maybe, I don't know, or maybe the planning guys would actually understand what architects are trying to achieve, or most of the time it's possibly developers just trying to push the envelope a little bit too far. Maybe that's actually the problem.
And look, I think that the whole purpose of planning is to have an outcome that's beneficial for the community and the environment. That the buildings or the infrastructure is going to be built in, but also to have that benefit of someone investing in a local area. So I think if you can have upfront clarity, you can visualize that in a twin and you can scenario build in the digital form, you'll actually have a better outcome for both parties. And I think this mutually beneficial aspect is one of the reasons that we're seeing planning applications as coming up very high priority in government digital twin initiatives.
I think that's a really good point to end on, I think, in terms of an outcome, in terms of a vision of where the future will be. But Kate, thanks very much for your time today.
My absolute pleasure.
Now, I have one question for you, the final question. Now, we've already talked about what you think digital twins mean to you, but this is the one question I ask all of my guests, and I'm looking forward to understanding your views on it coming from a digital twin and spatial industries perspective. What does BIM mean to you?
BIM to me is both a digital model of a piece of infrastructure, but also the process to create that model, design that model. Hopefully the BIM of a piece of infrastructure is something that can be used to help operate that asset over time, but is also information that can be used and accessed in wider systems. So I'm a digital twin kind of advocate. So what I see the BIM is a potential source of information for broader decision making outside the owner of that asset. So it's also an opportunity to collaborate in the digital world, like the building is part of, the system in the real world.
I think I might call your definition fairim. fair information management instead of better information management. But thank you very much for your time again, Kate.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting soon.
Now, for more information on Kate, digital twins, and a link to the event that Kate will be speaking at in October 2021, and the future recordings that will get changed over once the event's occurred, please head over to the podcast section of the Skewed website to obtain that further information and links. Now, I look forward to sharing our next podcast with you in a fortnight's time. Until then, good luck with your digital transition.
The digital transition.